All right, man, peace. So there are often multiple versions of the source of the Pistons versus Bulls rivalry, as well as different renditions as to why the Bulls were finally able to beat the Pistons. So I decided to make this video to utilize the official testimony of both sides. And let's see what conclusion we can come to.
And then there was the guy who'd become the league's best individual player, Michael Jordan of the Bulls. When the Pistons went to Chicago midway through the 87-88 season, they decided to send a message to him too.
Michael Jordan comes to the hole, I foul him.
Rebound Jordan.
All of a sudden you got Oakley coming through.
Now, if that foul occurs today, that's definitely a flagrant 2. And certainly a fine. I don't think he'd be suspended for that. But those horse collar fouls, they were very common back then, especially by the Pistons. As I stated in another video, I think that the level of physicality in the 80s, or the level of defense, I should say, is a little bit overrated. The defense in the 80s was not particularly that good until, other than the upper crust teams. And especially when you got to the playoffs, then it would get a lot more physical. But the Pistons were the first team to really bring an excessive amount of physicality into the league in the late 80s. Now, many of the old heads will deny that. They'll say that the Celtics and the Sixers and a lot of the upper level teams in the early 80s were just as quote unquote dirty as the Pistons. I disagree. I think that there are too many official witnesses who lived it. When I say lived it, I mean actual participants, players, who will note that the Pistons were by far the most overly aggressive and quote-unquote dirty team in the NBA. But what the Pistons also did was they showed many of the other teams that will come thereafter that you didn't have to have transcendent talent to win championships as long as you were mentally strong on both ends of the court, and that you executed on both ends of the court. That you would be able to make up the difference, the gulf or the gap between your team and a team that may be more talented if you utilize certain tactics. This game also, by the way, this game where Mahorn fouled Michael Jordan, very, very entertaining game if you get a chance to watch it on YouTube. Not only does Mahorn get kicked out of this game, obviously for the brawl that he instigated, but Michael Jordan also got into it with Adrian Dantley later on in the game.
We didn't get in a fight with the Bulls. Rick Mahorn got in a fight with the entire Bull organization.
We were reading the paper and they were talking about how, we trying to hurt people, and Jordan had accused Mahorn of trying to end his career and everything.
Let me say this. Not only did Michael Jordan accuse Rick Mahorn of trying to end his career, but Jordan also suspected, as many of the Bulls would often suspect, that it was Isaiah Thomas who was directing his teammates to try to excessively foul their team. That, of course, was a lot of the underlying enmity between Jordan and Isaiah Thomas, was Jordan's suspicion that Isaiah Thomas was the one who was behind his treatment by Isaiah Thomas's teammates when he went to the basket.
Media started getting on our case and about we were too physical and we're destroying the way basketball was played.
They called us thugs, and this isn't good for the game, this isn't good for the league.
We were being labeled as bad guys.
There's two ways you can react to the stereotypes.
Either we can use it to our advantage, or it's going to hinder us severely.
Now notice, Isaiah Thomas, being the extremely intelligent person that he was, he understood that the only thing that you can do in life is to concentrate on what you do well, whatever your gifts are, whatever your persona is. The Pistons realized that they would never be the Boston Celtics. They didn't have that dominant front court. They realized that they would never be the Showtime Lakers. They didn't have 4 number 1 draft picks on their team like the Lakers often did. So they understood that instead of trying to run from a moniker that people might consider insidious or not a term that you'd want to be called, the bad boys, they embraced it. Very similar to Kobe Bryant, who embraced the moniker of the Black Mamba, or really who really coined that term himself and named himself that term. Everybody cannot be the hero. We all know that. And there is certainly there's certainly something that's very attractive about anyone who can embrace who they actually are and maximize it. If you brothers have ever seen the film Unbreakable, which I might do a review on one day, if I'm inclined to and if I have the time, starring Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson. Basically, that film is about the dichotomy between good and evil. It's really about the bringing together of opposites. One person is able to figure out what his role is on the earth by bringing out the gifts of the other person.
And we have been trying to fight it for so long. Finally, we embrace it.
Okay, we'll be like the Oakland Raiders. The old Oakland Raiders.
All of a sudden, these half a dozen boxes show up to the Silverdome.
Hey guys, run on my shade. We'll just hold them up. Just hold them up.
We had to have that chip on our shoulder. It was us against the league. Either you love us or you hate us.
Every great team needs an identity. You can't be great in this league and have zero identity.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And you see that today with the New England Patriots. They've come to embrace their identity. People oftentimes now get into their own heads. When I say people, I mean the coaches of the other teams, because they're not sure if Belichick knows their plays. And throughout the league, teams are trying to steal each other's plays. But the fear with Belichick is that he's actually able to develop a game plan where he can capitalize on his knowledge of your plays. So as Joe Dumars stated so well, every great team has to have a verifiable identity so that they know how they should be playing. That's what leads to success in life, not just in sports, but as individuals also. That's why I always encourage brothers, whatever it is, whatever gifts that you have, cultivate those gifts. All right, so now we're going to jump ahead a little bit on the Chicago Bulls versus Detroit Pistons rivalry, the timeline of their rivalry and what led to the transition in power. Now we're at the 1988 Eastern Conference semifinals, which is the first time that the Bulls and Pistons met up in the playoffs in the Isaiah Thomas and Michael Jordan era. And let's see what happens.
In the 1988 playoffs, the Pistons would face Jordan and the Bulls in the second round. The Bad Boys against the scoring champ and league MVP.
Look at the air. Look at the...
He's also Defensive Player of the Year that year.
Look at the hang time. Look at the flying motion.
Not to mention, a guy doing it right down the street from where Isaiah Thomas had grown up.
Isaiah was probably one of the most popular athletes in Chicago. Jordan took Chicago away from him almost immediately.
He's being booed just like Bill Laimbeer in his old hometown.
Family and friends would just be straight up with you, like, I want the Bulls to win. And, your job was to basically break everybody's heart.
Let me say this quickly. One of the main reasons why Isaiah Thomas and Michael Jordan developed such an antipathy for each other was based in what was just noted right here in this feature. Isaiah Thomas, as we all know, is from Chicago, and he actually wanted to be drafted by the Chicago Bulls. He's on record as stating that Derrick Rose was able to fulfill his dream, Isaiah Thomas's dream, in being able to play for his hometown team. He wanted to be the person who brought the Bulls a championship. So when Jordan was drafted by the Bulls in '84, Isaiah Thomas, quite frankly, was jealous of the fact that Michael Jordan was receiving so much acclaim in his hometown. And John Sally is on record as detailing that when Isaiah Thomas went home to Chicago to visit one of his, I believe he said his nephew had Michael Jordan posters and jerseys all up on the wall, and that infuriated Isaiah Thomas. So a lot of the issues between Jordan and Isaiah Thomas were based in Isaiah Thomas's discomfort at the fact that Michael Jordan was becoming Chicago's favorite, and that's what he wanted to be. And we might look at it and say, that's petty jealousy, but a lot of what drives people is based in jealousy or envy, unfortunately. But sometimes when that energy is properly accrued, it can be used to achieve great things. Because Isaiah Thomas was, about 6 feet, maybe 6'1", and he was able to, oftentimes in the late 80s, go head-to-head with Michael Jordan in the playoffs. They would oftentimes guard each other one-on-one, particularly Michael Jordan guarding Isaiah Thomas, and Michael Jordan's on record as stating that Isaiah Thomas is the greatest player that he had to guard. Isaiah's skill set was nonpareil. As a little man, he can go left, go right with equal dexterity. Very rarely, if ever, can I remember seeing someone pick his pocket. His handle was that tight. And one of the great streak scorers in NBA history. But a lot of the animosity between Jordan and Isaiah Thomas was based in Isaiah Thomas's jealousy of Michael Jordan. And of course, as Jordan started to rise in the ranks in the late 80s, he was jealous of the fact that the Pistons were the better team. He was trying to figure out how to beat them. But mentally, he was not ready.
And he's hard.
The Pistons dropped Jordan and the Bulls in 5 quick games.
Yes, in '88, they beat him in 5. Once again, people who are interested, you could look up some of those games from the '88 playoffs on YouTube. And that's the great thing about YouTube. I've stated this before. YouTube is like the modern-day cyberspace version of the Library of Alexandria. You can pretty much research anything and everything here. So now we're once again going to move ahead in the timeline regarding the rise of the Detroit Pistons and, of course, the Pistons versus Bulls rivalry. Right now we're at 1988, really going into 89. The Pistons have made a very integral trade which precipitated their rise as champions, which is they moved Mr. Adrian Dantley, who was a Hall of Famer. They moved him to the Dallas Mavericks for Mcgwire, who is someone who I believe should be in the Hall of Fame. If he currently is, one of you brothers can correct me. I don't look up a lot of this stuff. I stated that Dennis Johnson wasn't in the Hall of Fame in the last video, and a brother brought to my attention that he was in. I remember when Dennis Johnson passed away that he was still not in the Hall of Fame. So the NBA corrected it post-mortem, unfortunately. Hopefully they don't do the same with this brother right here, Mcgwire, who was one of the top forwards of the 80s, but you very rarely hear about him because the 80s was packed with great forwards. But this man, Mcgwire, once scored over 30 points in 1 quarter in the playoffs. But anyway. As you can see, more than once, teams would oftentimes try to punk Joe Dumars. Why is that? Because he was the calm brother on the Pistons. A lot of these teams got tired of getting bullied. They would try to mess with Joe Dumars because they felt like he was calm and maybe he wouldn't do anything. Joe Dumars, one of the great 2 guards of the last 30-plus years. Oftentimes, many of these dudes will jump on the internet and talk about how Jordan didn't face any great 2 guards. All they show is their ignorance. Joe Dumars was a phenomenal player. Right? Just one of many great 2 guards that Michael Jordan faced in that era.
In the rhythm I'm rolling, got to give us what we want. Gotta give us what we need. Our freedom of speech is freedom of death. We got to fight the powers that be. Fight the power. 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 Here come the Pistons. And make it 18.
Now, did you see Dennis Rodman leading the fast break, throwing an alley-oop to John Sally? The Pistons had one of the great team IQs, basketball IQs in NBA history. They're one of the first teams that had multiple players that could play a variety of positions and fill a variety of roles. Once again, Bill Laimbeer was not just someone who hit people with dirty fouls or hard fouls. He was one of the first stretch 5s. And of course, you had the great Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and Vinnie Johnson, who are 3-headed backcourt. Extremely high basketball IQ. All of them had great handle, great scoring ability, and they could all distribute. And then, of course, you have Mcgwire, who was a scoring machine. Very, very, very difficult team for 2 years, for 3 years in a row.
boys finished the season on a 30-4 run, giving them the best record in the league. But there were a few costs to the way they went about it.
In those days, we didn't have flagrant foul rules.
Now look at these fines. Once again, just to prove my point, because once again, a lot of brothers who watch basketball in the 80s, they try to state that the Pistons were no more dirty than any other team. No, that is not accurate. They were fined far more than every other team, and it wasn't just because the NBA was concentrating on them more. They were known for being dirty, for trying to intimidate, and look, that's part of the game. At least it was back then. But you make alterations and changes to your rule book, to your law code, as different people create dynamics where you have to make those changes and those alterations. The Pistons brought an excessive amount of physicality to the NBA, and it resulted in them having to alter and change some of the rules. Isaiah Thomas has alleged that the NBA changed the rules so that Michael Jordan could win. Many Piston fans also say the same thing. What has to be understood is that I'm sure that they did change many rules so that they could ease the flow of the game and take away a lot of the quote-unquote thuggery that the Pistons were utilizing to win their championships. But those tactics really have only taken away from the Pistons' legacy, because they were an extremely intelligent team, very well coached, and they're very well coached on the floor as well. But do I believe that the league purposefully changed the rules so that Michael Jordan could win? I believe that the league wanted to move forward from the bad boy era. The growth of the NBA started with the rivalry between the Lakers and Celtics, which had the proper mix of physicality and proper flow. The league did not like the fact that the Pistons were accentuating the physicality and taking away from the flow of the game. So, and of course, you had this young stallion in Michael Jordan that you wanted to utilize as a proper chess piece to bring basketball to the masses globally. You were not going to be able to sell global basketball through the Detroit Pistons. So, of course, Dick Ebersol, in concert with David Stern, there's very little doubt in my mind that they did not want the Pistons to even have the opportunity to play dirty. I don't think it had anything to do with them not wanting them to win. If they were still able to win with the flagrant foul rules, then so be it. But you don't get swept in a series because they bring in flagrant foul rules. Sorry. It just doesn't happen that way. The Pistons were a great team that met their end. But once again, to bring it back to the point, as you can see here with this list of team fines, the Detroit Pistons were the team that stepped over the bounds by far in the NBA. And this was back in an era where you did not have flagrant foul rules.
So most of the fines had to do with fighting. The game was played at that time in a very, very physical manner. And we allowed stuff that we don't allow today.
And let me say this also. The game was a little bit more physical back then. But in this era today, the players are so much faster and stronger because of the conditioning techniques that are utilized, that the game is also probably just as physical today as it was back then, just because of the speed in which the players move across the court. So it's almost equivalent. It's like the NFL. In the 80s, they were allowed to headhunt and lay people out and things of that nature. Receivers going across the middle could get clotheslined. You can't do that today. But at the same time today, you have cornerbacks and safeties that are the size that linebackers were back in the 80s. You know, most of your linebackers back in the 80s were somewhere between 220 to 230. Now you have wide receivers that are that size. Okay, so that when we talk about the change in the regulations and the rules in these different leagues, you also have to take into account that professional sports now is much more scientific. There's a lot more scientific modification that's involved in regards to athletes' training techniques, and the games are much faster now. So even though a lot of the physicality has been legislated out, it's still there because of the speed of the collisions and the speed of the movement.
If I had it to do over again, we would be more aggressive in regulating, shall we say, that style of play. because it led to our game becoming much more physical.
We would be in other cities, and the headlines are, "We're not afraid of the Pistons. We'll fight them if we have to." You read that kind of stuff and you go, okay, game's over. Because they're not thinking about playing a game.
Absolutely.
In the '89 playoffs, the Pistons didn't lose a game on their way to the conference finals. And that brought them face to face again with Michael Jordan. Jordan and the Bulls won a game in Detroit. And then he looked practically invincible in Chicago. And with seconds left in Game 3, the ball was in his hands.
Now, quickly before I let this play run, please pay attention. There's Dennis Rodman on Michael Jordan. And I mentioned this before. Dennis Rodman was the player that Chuck Daly would use in clutch situations to guard the opposing team's best player or most potent offensive threat. If they were playing the Lakers, he'd put Rodman on Magic, or he'd put Rodman on James Worthy if James Worthy had it going. Celtics, he put him on Larry Bird. With the Bulls in his clutch situation, he put him on Jordan. Because even though Dumars did a great job on Jordan, Jordan was too tall for Dumars in that type of situation to entrust Joe to be able to get a stop. Because Jordan could just leap over people. And in this situation, he's even going to leap over Rodman, but at least Rodman provides some size. The point of me stopping this video was to show once again Dennis Rodman, one of the great athletes in NBA history, would guard Larry Bird, and Larry Bird would light him up. And just to show brothers, once again, the brothers who've only watched this era of basketball, who would claim that Larry Bird cannot play today, if he could light up Dennis Rodman, he could light up anybody today. It'd be no problem. Same thing with Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan in this NBA today, he'd have a field day. He'd be like a Russell Westbrook, except he'd be shooting over 50%.
Hands with a chance to go up 2-1 in the series.
5 seconds to go. Jordan off the glass. It's over. Chicago wins.
That was get the ball, Michael. Everybody get out of the way.
Doug Collins is an example of a stepping stone coach. One of these coaches who knows the game, but he does not have the emotional stability, the psychological stability to lead a team to a championship. A great coach has to be able to galvanize his team and give an image of a leader who's unwavering. Michael Jordan would often complain about Doug Collins' emotional ups and downs. He was like, we come in the locker room after a big win and this guy's in there crying. We come in after a big loss and he's in there crying. He said, we can't have that. And that was the importance of Phil Jackson. Phil Jackson brought, that Zen serenity that he had. That was big for the Bulls because they needed that. Whenever you're going through adversity and you're able to maintain a level head, or there's someone around you who can maintain that level-headedness, that does a lot to help see you through, those tumultuous times. And Doug Collins just didn't have it.
Out of the way. Go to the basket.
He and Jordan would have big arguments, man. Big fights and big arguments, because Jordan was very high strung himself at times. So Jordan needed somebody to calm him down. It's like two people in a relationship and they're both high strung. When somebody's high strung, they have to be with somebody calm who can deal with them. Like a trainer, or a psychotherapist. And Jordan needed that because he was extremely high strung and super, super, super competitive.
Talked to Isaiah later that night. He said he went out by Michigan Avenue on the water out there. He said he sat out there for like 4 or 5 hours.
Dumars and I were on the phone for hours talking about 23 and red.
You on the phone for hours talking about a guy who supposedly was very, very easy to guard. Easier to guard than Larry Bird. That's what they've stated, the bad boy Pistons, who couldn't go left. Clearly, Michael Jordan was very difficult to guard. But let me say this. He mentally, he wasn't ready to beat the Pistons. That team was nowhere near ready to beat the Pistons. And it's a miracle that they won 2 games in '89. And it was due to Jordan's greatness and how thirsty they were to break through, but they were not ready. But once again, I'm going through this video just to show people that that the reason why the Bulls finally won in '91 was because they were just a better team. It had nothing to do with anything else. And there was no other team that was even able to beat the Pistons in that playoff run in '89 other than the Bulls. The Bulls did better against them than the Lakers did. And I know people are going to say, well, Magic got hurt and all this other stuff. Look, the Pistons were going to smoke them regardless. They were not built to beat the Pistons at that time. The Lakers were in the middle of transitioning from the Kareem era, into another incarnation of the Magic Johnson-led Lakers. But the Bulls, they were coming. They didn't have the understanding of the game yet.
It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and I get a phone call, and it's Isaiah. And he says, "I've finally figured out what we need to do to stop Jordan."
Jordan has not been an offensive force in this game.
We are playing entirely different today. More double teams at different positions, and we're much more aggressive.
Here's his best player in the league, and here's his bunch of role players. How are they?
Well, they wasn't a bunch of role players. The Pistons have 4 Hall of Famers. This guy here, Sam Smith, wrote a very, very good book about Michael Jordan called The Jordan Rules. This was the guy who provided a lot of inside information into Michael Jordan that people did not know about, that was beyond the pale, that was beyond the corporate image that he conveyed on commercials. He showed Jordan to be someone who could be petty, who was not in control of his emotions because of his super competitiveness, who was punching teammates and freezing teammates out. Once again, that's why I stated he was not ready mentally to beat the Pistons. And when you see that little clip of how they would draw him into certain defensive situations, it was because he was overly aggressive. That's what the triangle offense did for Jordan. It gave him a framework to understand how to use his teammates because he did not know how to properly use his teammates at that time to beat a championship level team. His greatness could beat every other team in the NBA except for championship level teams in those moments. And that's the importance of having Phil Jackson. There was a moment in the '91 finals against the Lakers in Game 5 where Phil Jackson actually had to chastise Michael Jordan in the huddle because he was not finding John Paxson.
How are they doing it? They must have some trick. Oh, it's the Jordan rules. They've got this secret Jordan rules.
The Jordan rules. Is that something you guys made up?
On the switch, Jordan. Guarded by Lambeer. No easy layup.
Now, did you hear what the commentator Dick Stockton said? He said, no easy layups. Once again, that's the difference between that era and this era here. There's no such thing as the no layup rule in this era. And one of the main reasons why there's no such thing as the no layup rule is because, of course, number one, the NBA is concentrating on excessively hard fouls. But number two, you have the stretch 4. So that takes the power forward out of the lane. Back in that era, your 4-man and your 5-man would be waiting in the lane for anybody who penetrated.
Jordan rule? No, I don't know what that is.
It was like the Vinci Code, the formula to Coca-Cola, and the Jordan rules.
You're not going to give your game plan away on television, man.
This is the Jordan rules. If Michael was isolated, we forced him to dribble the ball to the middle of the floor. If he was in the middle of the floor, we forced him left. The nearest defender would run and double team him.
Hit him on screens every time to wear him down. Every time he drove, you sent 3 or 4 people at him.
Jordan. Robert. Every time he came in that lane, he was boom. And that's what we're talking about when the Pistons want to make Jordan.
Once again, they use his aggressiveness against him. That's what I mean when I say sometimes people can have too many gifts, or you can use their gifts against them. Sometimes a gift can also be a curse, right? There's a very, very thin line between aggressiveness and bullheadedness. No pun intended. And Jordan had to learn that sometimes you have to acquiesce responsibilities and acquiesce talent, meaning you have to spread your talent around to make your other teammates better.
Jordan Payne, whenever he gets in the paint. Let me try you looking right. You see Michael Jordan on the grind getting away. Oh, man.
Physically, I wasn't ready. And I didn't have the energy to go against that.
And kudos to him for acknowledging that. See, Michael Jordan didn't sit there and say, oh, well, the reason why we lost is because of the fouling and all that other stuff. Now, he might mention that off camera, And Jordan was not above a little skullduggery and trying to court referees to be on his side. There are stories of him taking referees out to eat to try to get them to give him some calls. But he was intelligent enough to, number one, understand what he needed to do to become a better player in order to beat a team that was on that mental level. The Pistons were extremely mentally tough, man.
Anybody but him. He was not going to beat us. That was the Jordan rules. We didn't even think about Scottie Pippen. It was Michael Jordan and the Jordan-heirs, and you can't win championships like that with only one player.
Agreed. You certainly cannot win a championship with just one player, no matter how great the player is, and that's part of the learning process.
The Pistons won the next 3 games to close out the Bulls in 6.
And we'll continue this on part 2. Peace.